casi todo el mundo, el consumo de marihuana es considerado un acto ilícito y penalizable. Solo en algunos países como Uruguay o ciertos estados de la Unión Americana, el consumo recreativo y medicinal de la cannabis se encuentra permitido y regulado. Aquí en nuestro país, después de 10 años de combatir sin mucho éxito al narcotráfico y después de miles de personas encarceladas por consumir una simple planta, quizá, o no, quítele usted quizá, ha llegado el momento de pensar en nuevas estrategias. Con esto en mente, hoy decidí reunirme con Ethan Nadelmann, quien es fundador y director de la organización Drug Policy Alliance. Con él platicaré de los retos que conlleva despenalizar el consumo de la marihuana y los beneficios que pudiera tener en la sociedad de este Nuevo México. Ethan, to what extent do you think that decriminalizing the whole process of production, distribution and consumption of drugs contributes to diminish the levels of violence in any society, and in particular in Mexican society?
Well, you know, we have to make a distinction between decriminalization, which essentially means removing the criminal sanctions, and legalization, which is another word for legal regulation. And so to the extent that it's possible to move from a prohibitionist policy, which relies on the police, the prosecutors, military, what have you, first and foremost, to a policy of legal regulation, like we have for pharmaceutical drugs, alcohol, tobacco, that would have a dramatic impact in reducing the violence, the crime, the corruption, all of the other problems that you have in Mexico, that we have to some extent in the United States and in many other countries. Now, obviously with marijuana, we're already doing it in the United States. So is Canada. So is Uruguay. Other countries are moving in that direction. It would be nice to see some progress in Mexico.
And why do you think that there's no progress in Mexico? Do you think that the relationship, the close relationship, the close frontier with the United States is one of the explanations of this?
Not anymore. Not anymore, because Canada is next to the United States as well. So, and it's also interesting because here you have, in Mexico, many distinguished leaders from across the political spectrum. I mean, you have not just your former president, Vicente Fox, calling for the legalization of all drugs. You have your former president, Zedillo, who's on the Global Drug Policy Commission, similarly calling for the legalization of all drugs. Even Calderon, with his drug war, he still goes to the United Nations and says we need to reevaluate the prohibitionist policy. Jorge Castaneda, your former foreign minister, Javier Cecilia from the other part of the political spectrum, all saying we need to move in the direction of legal regulation. So I think the problem is, one, that when the presidents and others are in power, they remain afraid to actually call for change. It's after they leave. And I think the second thing is that the population in Mexico remains conservative, ignorant, biased, unopen to change. In the United States and Canada now, almost 60% of the public supports the legalization of marijuana, and it was only 25% a few decades ago. In Mexico, it's barely 35%. So I don't know what that's about, but it's clearly the Mexican public supporting a retention of a policy which is so obviously failing.
En México, la política de drogas ha sido sumamente punitiva y en muchos casos enfocada en la detención de los consumidores, aun cuando se haya demostrado que legislar y despenalizar el uso de por lo menos la cannabis ayuda a reducir los niveles de violencia y ganar dinero con impuestos. Aquí parece que nuestros legisladores tienen otras prioridades. Trying to imagine that this problem be submitted to the public opinion and the grounds that Mexican society is conservative, perhaps the results were negative.
Yeah.
They wouldn't approve.
I think that's right, because you know we did the change in the United States. The initial changes on marijuana laws and also other parts of the drug war came through our ballot initiatives, our public referendum, which is a way of changing the laws in roughly half of the 50 states in the United States. And after we did enough of those, typically in the states in the western United States, then eventually the state legislatures and politicians would begin to follow suit. In Mexico, you don't really have a referendum or initiative process, as I understand. So it depends upon politicians either providing the leadership or some pressure coming from the public, and that has yet to happen. I'll tell you one example. In Uruguay, which a few years ago became the first country to legally regulate marijuana, there the policy never had more support than 40% of the public. But President Mujica decided it was the right thing to do. He provided the leadership. There was a tradition of strong party discipline, and they were able to move forward with the reform.
And is it the same case in Uruguay as in Portugal, that levels of violence and even levels of consumption have been diminishing?
Basically, yes. And it's not just the levels of consumption, it's all the problems associated with that. You know, if you think about it, do we really care whether or not the amount of alcohol use goes up or down? Not so much. What we want is we want the alcohol addiction to go down, the alcohol accidents on the roads to go down, the cirrhosis to go down. So I think what you see in Portugal, which did not legalize anything, but they essentially stopped arresting anybody for the possession of a small amount of drugs, and they made a very strong commitment to treating drug use and addiction as a health problem, not a criminal problem, right?
Aun cuando varias propuestas han sido llevadas al Congreso, los políticos y la sociedad todavía consideran el consumo de la marihuana como algo negativo, muy mal visto. Pero eso sí, no hay que olvidar que su prohibición viola uno de nuestros derechos fundamentales: la libertad de consumir lo que nosotros queramos, siempre y cuando no afectemos a terceros.
So one wonders, why don't take this important step in our political, social, and economic life? It looks like we can only envisage advantages about this.
Well, you know, it's interesting because
we were talking about bias, about traditional views.
Well, you have, you know, the Catholics, evangelical, religious. You know, sometimes I think one way you need to change public opinion. Imagine that you take your most popular telenovela and you take your most beloved grandmother or mother figure, and you write in the story that she unfortunately gets cancer. And she's dealing, her hair's falling out, she's nauseous, she can't eat, she has no appetite. And her children, her grandchildren, her doctor even says, you know, take the marijuana, it will help with the nausea. No, she says, no, it's illegal, it's immoral.
It's a sinful
thing. Try it, sinful, try it. And finally the episode ends when she takes a puff and the nausea diminishes and her appetite returns and a smile comes. Now those are the ways in which one can change public opinion.
That might certainly change the point of view of many who are biased.
It played an important role in the United States because we did the initial political work to change the laws at the local level, but then the entertainment media began to do programs like this just because they knew the audience would like it, and that helped increase the support even more.
A lo largo de los años y alrededor de todo el mundo, la marihuana ha pasado de la prohibición a la tolerancia y de la tolerancia muchas veces a la legalización. En Holanda, por ejemplo, desde 1976 se permite la venta y consumo de marihuana en espacios acotados. Otros países como Austria, Alemania e Italia permiten su uso con fines terapéuticos. En contraste, aquí en México, la mera posesión de 6 gramos o más conlleva una sanción y la cárcel.
There's actually political will to do it that way. Former presidents, intellectuals, scholars. How was this process in the United States, for instance?
Well, you know, it's an interesting thing. There's a contrast between Latin America and the U.S. on this. In the U.S., it was really public opinion, driven by oftentimes advocacy organizations, activists like my organization and others, that helped to move public opinion and to change the laws initially, with the politicians typically lagging behind. In Latin America, it's oftentimes been the distinguished former politicians, sometimes the current politicians, who have actually provided the leadership, and the public is lagging behind. So as I said, Mujica in Uruguay, the president, while he was president. Santos in Colombia, who is still president now, providing leadership. In Guatemala, before he went to jail, but Otto Perez Molina, the former right-wing military general who became president, advocated for the legalization of drugs, and for the right reason, not the wrong reason, right? Yeah. So you've had these former presidents, current presidents providing the leadership, and then meanwhile it's the public that keeps sort of doing, and I think somehow there's a failure of public education or a lack of understanding. Or it may be that people think the government is so corrupt that, you know, legalization will not diminish the gangsters, it'll just empower the gangsters who are an ally with the government and all this, but I don't.
Legislar el consumo, distribución y producción de marihuana es una propuesta que ya está dentro de la agenda política mexicana. Sin embargo, requiere del apoyo de los ciudadanos para que salga adelante. En el próximo episodio, seguiré conversando con Ethan Nadelmann para conocer más beneficios de la legalización de la marihuana y aprender cómo esta ruta podría ayudar a crear un mejor y más libre Nuevo México.